solar power arrays in orbit around Earth, beaming energy down to us, clean and abundant, 24/7. It sounds great. The idea is called space-based solar power. I made a video about this a year ago that I thought was kind of critical, but 2 recent reports have put my critical thinking to shame. They've basically killed the idea, and not in a fun laser beam from space kind of way. Let's have a look. Governments all over the planet have been scraping the bottoms of their barrels for the next crazy idea that's going to save us from climate change. Space-based solar power is one of the things they found down there, right next to old banana peels and lint balls. It's an idea from the 1970s, but in the past decade, several groups of engineers have put forward new designs for solar power stations in orbit. The basic concept is to put sunlight collectors into space, convert the energy into a microwave beam, and send that to a receiver station on the surface of our planet. The major difficulty is that the station has to simultaneously collect light from the sun and aim the beam at the receiver station. This requires the parts of the power plant to be movable. Most designs opt for a swarm of collectors that must be coordinated, which sounds like a really good idea and certainly isn't going to increase the space junk problem at all. In total, these power plants are typically a few kilometers in extension and weigh several thousand tons. An obvious problem with the idea is that getting that much stuff into space is expensive. Then again, the cost of launching stuff into space is rapidly dropping. Another problem is that you expect the total efficiency to be miserable because you have multiple energy conversions and must transport the energy over several 10,000 kilometers. Then again, if you can make up for that by collecting so much more power, maybe it doesn't matter. There's also the issue of cosmic radiation, dust and space debris that would pretty much constantly damage the equipment. A not so obvious problem is that space-based solar power also takes up a lot of land. It's because the power density of the beam must be fairly low unless you want birds to drop from the sky fully roasted. Consequently, the receiver arrays on Earth usually cover something in the ballpark of 50 to 100 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Manhattan. Still, some countries have invested into the idea. In particular, the Brits seem to like it. In 2021, the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy asked the consulting agency Fraser Nash for a feasibility assessment of space-based solar power. They concluded that it is feasible to realize a constellation of solar power satellites delivering a substantial percentage of the UK's energy needs by the early 2040s. Companies and research institutions, including Airbus, Cambridge University and Lockheed Martin, have invested into the idea. The Chinese say they want to have a power station in orbit by 2030. The company Japan Space Systems wants to get it done even earlier, by 2025. In 2022, NASA said they'll be looking into the idea, and the first news today is that the NASA report appeared earlier this year. They have studied how expensive space-based solar power would be per electricity produced, averaged over the lifetime of the power plant. They found that in the 2 baseline scenarios that they looked at, it'd be hugely more expensive than ground-based renewable energy. They then relaxed many of the assumptions that they had made and allowed for some optimistic developments, launch costs dropping faster than expected, photovoltaic cells becoming more efficient, and so on. They find that if all the stars align perfectly, then space-based solar power might just about be competitive. The other thing that happened is a study from an engineer who previously worked at ESA that was recently published in IEEE. He points out a few issues that hadn't occurred to me previously. For example, he says, a few times a year the satellites would come into Earth's shadow, and that'd lead to a sudden temperature drop of around 300 degrees Celsius. That's tough to cope with for standard electronics. The other thing he points out is that it'll be very difficult to even aim the beam. It's because the transmitter of these power stations isn't one single device. It's a phased array that's made up of millions of small parts that must be very precisely synchronized with each other. This is extremely difficult and will probably reduce the efficiency even more. The ESA is currently working on their own report about the technological and economic feasibility of developing a space-based solar power program. The report is due next year. I expect they'll come to similar conclusions as NASA, and if that happens, I think that'll be the end of space-based solar power. Then again, there's probably more stuff at the bottom of that barrel, maybe giant hamster wheels or harnessing the energy of stupid jokes. Hey, that one could actually work. Can you sue your government into action on climate change? Yes, you can, and you have good chances to be successful. An increasing number of people and organizations are doing exactly that. But what will the consequences be? Let's have a look. A few months ago, 18 California school children sued the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA for short, for allegedly violating their constitutional rights. The children claimed that the EPA failed to protect them from harm caused by climate change. Heat waves, wildfires, droughts and floods, they say, have had severe negative effects on their lives. The decision is pending. That people sue over environmental problems caused by others is of course nothing new. The first case on record goes back to the 17th century when an Englishman sued because his neighbour's pigsty was supposedly depriving him of wholesome air. The defendant made a case for the utility of hogs, but the court decided in favour of the plaintiff. Carbon dioxide is the new pig smell, basically, and people have sued over it for more than 2 decades. In 2002, the American charity organisation Friends of Earth sued several financial institutions, among others the Export-Import Bank of America, over financing fossil fuel projects. They claimed that the institutions failed to evaluate the damage that these projects would do to the environment as US law would have required. The judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and US institutions are now required to consider damages incurred by carbon dioxide emissions. That was in 2002, and for a while these cases were far and in between. But their number has exploded since Fridays for Future started. According to a recent report from the law school at Columbia University, New York, there are now more than 2,000 climate change cases under investigation worldwide, with the trend steeply increasing. About 50% of those that have been decided already went in favor of the plaintiff. Suing seems to be particularly popular in the United States. In 2020, 16 young activists ranging in age from 5 to 22 sued the state of Montana. They argued that the state's refusal to consider climate impacts before supporting fossil fuel developments violated their rights to a clean and healthy environment under the Montana state constitution. The judge ruled in their favor, and the Montana government is now required to think about carbon emissions before handing out money. Whether that'll make much of a difference remains to be seen. But one can get an idea for what the consequences might be from earlier lawsuits. For example, in 2013, the non-profit organization Uganda sued the Dutch government over not doing enough to protect its citizens. In 2015, the Dutch Supreme Court agreed with them and ruled that by 2020, the government must cut fossil fuel emissions by 25% compared to 1919. The Dutch government didn't care all that much and would have missed that target had it not been for COVID that just so happened to reduce carbon emissions enough in 2020. A similar story played out in the UK, where the Parliament imposed very ambitious climate change goals on itself and then didn't live up to it. The environmental charity Client Earth sued. In 2023, the High Court ordered the government to strengthen its net zero strategy, but not much happened, and so the charity returned to court in February 2024. Basically, there isn't all that much one can do in a democratic system to force a the government into action. The likely outcome of all that suing is that governments will just ditch their climate goals, as just happened in Scotland. No doubt someone is going to sue over this. But will it make a difference? These have all been examples of one particular type of lawsuit, that in which citizens claim that their government has violated its own legislation. But there are other ways that people have sued over climate change. A very important case was decided just a few weeks ago in the European Union. A group of about 2,000 Swiss women claimed that the Swiss government violated their human rights by not doing enough to combat climate change. The case went to the European Court of Human Rights, and the court decided in favor of the Swiss women. This is a very big decision, because if the Swiss government has been found guilty of a human rights violation, then billions of other people could sue their own governments as well. But what does that ruling mean? It means that the Swiss government is now legally required to do more to protect its citizens. Exactly what, however, the ruling doesn't specify. And Switzerland is such a small country that its carbon footprint basically doesn't make any difference for global warming. So maybe they'll put up signs telling people to not camp on melting glaciers. One other type of lawsuit which I want to mention is that of people suing companies, like this Peruvian farmer who says that climate change threatens his village because a nearby glacier is melting off, and he's suing the German utility RWE. I'm not sure why a German company in particular is responsible for ruining a Peruvian glacier, but the case is in the works. The Peruvian wants about 20,000 euro to fix up his farm, so there's not a huge amount of money at stake, but if you multiply that by some 100 million people, soon we'll be talking real money. I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect that all this suing by environmental activists will soon have a backlash in which the other side takes its case to court, arguing in favor of the utility of fossil fuels. So keep calm and keep dusting your solar panels. It's been some crazy busy weeks for AI. Google has a new text-to-video tool. OpenAI released a new GPT model that can speak, and someone thinks it's their voice. Multiple studies have found that AI is really good at understanding humans. A whole bunch of people who worked on AI safety left OpenAI. And I'll tell you why I think we're totally not taking this seriously enough. According to a recent report from Stanford University, both corporate and private investment into AI has seen a decline in 2023, but funding for generative AI models like ChatGPT increased by almost a factor 8 from 2022 to reach more than $25 billion in 2023. The vast majority of that money comes from the United States. The cost of the larger models is increasing rapidly. Note that the vertical axis is a log scale. OpenAI's new GPT version cost about $78 million just to train, and Google's Gemini Ultra cost a whopping $191 million. But hey, at least we're getting something out of it. For example, this crotcheted elephant. It was produced by Google's new text-to-video tool, which is called Veo, and can create videos at ultra-high definition up to 1 minute long. Unfortunately for the EU, there isn't even a waiting list yet, which is too bad. Meanwhile, here's an image of a crotcheted Einstein. Then we have the launch of GPT-4o. The O stands for Omni, the Latin word for all, because the model can process text, audio, images, and video. They've put out some very neat demos.
Can you first identify which sides of the triangle are the opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse relative to angle alpha?
All right, so I'm pretty sure this is the angle alpha right here, right?
Perfect. That's correct.
Did this voice sound familiar to you? The actress Scarlett Johansson thinks it's hers. It turns out that OpenAI made her an offer for usage rights a while ago, but she declined. She thinks it still sounds very much like her. But does it? I mean, listen to it yourself.
It has been an absolute pleasure.
Actually, side AC is called the adjacent side to the angle alpha.
In any case, Johansson hired a lawyer who sent letters, and OpenAI removed this voice. Another odd thing that's been going on at OpenAI is that multiple people left and the super alignment team has disbanded. This group of researchers was tasked with making sure that the goals and values of an artificial general intelligence would be aligned with humans. So, to avoid human extinction. It seems like a good idea. But apparently the super alignment group didn't feel like they were appreciated. One of the people who left is John Leiker, who was head of the super alignment team, and another, Ilya Sutskever, one of the co-founders of the organization, who already last year raised concerns about the CEO, Sam Altman. It doesn't seem to have been a big fallout, maybe more like an alignment problem. They could have asked AI for help, maybe to be more persuasive, because a recent study in more than 800 people found that they find GPT-4 is significantly more convincing in debates than a human, especially if it was given access to some personal information that was anonymized and shared in the initial survey. Even more creepy, another recent study found that large language models like GPT are as good as humans in coming up with a theory of mind. That's the ability to understand what someone else was probably thinking in a given situation. In this study, they compared the abilities of more than 1,900 humans with several large language models, including GPT-4 and Meta's Llama. The humans and AIs were then asked to complete 5 typical theory of mind tests, such as understanding irony, or that someone else can't possibly know what you know. GPT-4 came out on top in most categories, even better than humans. So what's next? I have little doubt that we'll get to artificial general intelligence. The question is not whether it'll happen, but just when. Personally, I think that these current models look more impressive than they are, because they're missing a lot of information. They can't know, for example, that humans have bones, and that these bones move in some ways and not others. They're missing a lot of physical information, and it'll be difficult to fix that, because in contrast to text and images, there's not a lot of data to train on. This is why I think AGI is at least 5 years in the future. And yes, I worry about it, but not about alignment. That'll become a problem eventually, but the much more obvious first problem is not the AGI, but the people who own them. They'll suddenly have enormous power and influence because their AGI will tell them exactly what they need to say and do to be convincing. And humans are very predictable, especially because they believe they are not. Maybe the Chinese government will just convince us that democracy is for the weak, or maybe Putin will convince us that we should all join the Soviet Empire, or someone will convince us that he's God's son and we need to follow his 10 commandments. Oh, wait. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, the French physician Didier Raoult claimed to have found a cure, hydroxychloroquine. The good news spread globally very quickly, to no small part thanks to the enthusiastic support of Donald Trump. The results of the study were quickly questioned by other scientists. But this wasn't the end of the story. Unbelievable as it sounds, the story is still going on today. Let me start with introducing the main character, Didier Raoult. He works in the field of microbiology and is basically the personification of everything that's wrong with scientific research at the moment. From 2008 to 2022, he was director of a research institute on tropical diseases. He authored more than 2,300 publications and is one of the best-cited microbiologists in the world. He got there in no small part because he was an author of pretty much every paper that was published by anyone at his institute. What do tropical diseases have to do with COVID? Not much, but hydroxychloroquine is normally used to treat malaria, so Raoult quite plausibly said he knew something about how it works. He put out results of a small trial very quickly in March 2020, claiming that the drugs helps the body to clear out COVID. The study was almost immediately flagged for being highly problematic. In particular, the Dutch microbiologist Elizabeth Bick pointed out that the people in the treatment treatment group were on average much younger than those in the control group, which plausibly explained the difference in outcomes. Also, the 6 people who died were removed from the data, which probably helped the conclusion. Stunningly enough, the paper nevertheless passed peer review within 24 hours. The idea that COVID could be cured by an already existing medication was incredibly appealing at a time when most countries went into the first lockdowns. People all over the world ran into pharmacies to get hydroxychloroquine. A man in Arizona tragically died after poisoning himself with a similarly named substance that's used to keep fish tanks clean. Raoul quickly attracted a very dedicated following among anti-vaxxers by advertising his miracle cure on Twitter. He followed up on the first trial with several others, but the excitement faded within a few months after the results could not be reproduced. Larger trials found later that hydroxychloroquine has no significant impact on either the prevention or cure of COVID. And because the drug has a lot of side effects, national health agencies recommended against using it for treating COVID. But that wasn't the end of the story. For one thing, Raoult went after the people who had criticized his research, notably Elizabeth Bick. He speculated that she was being paid by the pharmaceutical industry for discrediting a competitor of the antiviral drug remdesivir and sued her for allegedly harassing and blackmailing him. Then the bomb dropped last year when Raoult announced he had done another huge trial about, guess what? The use of hydroxychloroquine for the treatment of COVID. I do not kid you. He wrote that he'd recruited more than 30,000 people and found that the drug reduces mortality from COVID. That he claims his earlier conclusions were correct isn't so surprising. The surprising part is that the trial ran from March 2020 until the end of 2021. This means it continued long after the French government had withdrawn permission to use the drug to treat COVID patients, and the trial had no ethics approval. This means that it put patients' lives at unnecessary risk. Shortly after the paper appeared, an open letter was published in the French newspaper Le Monde, signed by 14 learned societies calling for an investigation of Raoult's doings. The paper about the new trial was nevertheless published last year in October in an Elsevier journal. In April, after almost 3 years, the French court dismissed Raoult's charges against Elizabeth Bick. However, he still claimed on Twitter just last week that she harasses him. In the latest iteration of this drama, Raoult sued Julien Limousin, a professor of mathematics. Limousin had compiled a list of shortcomings of Raoult's papers on Twitter, which Raoult argued amounts to a defamation. The case went to court, where Limousin was greeted by a group of anti-vaxxers who shouted insults at him. Raoult, it seems, talked at length about his supposed scientific achievements, but the court was not interested in his self-praise and dismissed the charges against Limousin. But the real story is that Raoult's hydroxychloroquine episode drew attention to all his other studies, many of which, it turned out, had no ethics approval either. In December last year, the publisher PLOS flagged 49 of the studies from Raoult's institute because of possible breaches of ethics regulations. The American Society for Microbiology has retracted 7 papers, scientific reports too. Many of these studies were done on people in homeless shelters or they were refugees. I find it highly worrying that something like this can go on for so long in a nation with such a high scientific standard as our neighbor country France. I know you expect me to end with a joke, but there's nothing funny about this. People died because they didn't receive the treatment that they needed. This shouldn't have happened, and I hope it'll never happen again. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.